Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Bob with 1L and Back, and we are going to be talking in this video specifically the breakdown of a bar question, right? What is a bar question made of? You might call this the anatomy of a bar question. We're going to use a lot of different analogies, I'm sure, to talk about it. But essentially, every bar question, and when we talk about a bar question in this video, we're talking specifically about the MBE questions, right? Those 200 questions you take on day 2 of the bar exam. Every one of those MBE questions is going to follow a pretty standard format, right? A pretty standard system that the bar examiners use when they write these questions. And once you've done enough of these questions, the real power, and we talk about this and I get into some of my other videos, if you can understand how these questions are written, I encourage you to start even writing some yourself. You're going to find that this is going to open up huge possibilities. It's going to make all these questions seem so much easier when we understand how they're actually put together. So, what do we want to start with? We want to start by saying that every MBE question has essentially 3 parts, right? We have the fact pattern, we have the call of the question, and we have the answer choices. Now, this is straightforward, and to a certain extent, every multiple choice question is going to have, on any exam, is going to have the same setup. What's going to make the bar exam questions unique, and we talk about this a little bit, is the way that these 3 pieces interact, right? None of these parts, none of these components we're going to see can be analyzed or dealt with separately, if you will. We have to see how each of them play together. Why am I saying that? Well, if you go back, you think about my first video where I really encourage everyone to start, which is those 10 things that you absolutely have to know going into the bar exam. The idea is that this is not a law exam. This is not an exam where we're going to use the skills of analysis, reasoning, argumentation that we learned, all good stuff to get through law school. So every bar question is going to be broken down into these 3 distinct aspects, right? We have our fact pattern, we have our call of the question, and we have our answer choices. And again, what makes bar questions unique is that we can't deal with any one of these individual units and think that it's sufficient to understand the entire question. Now, I never like talking about the LSAT, but I will talk about it here in this one example. On the LSAT, at least on some questions, from what I remember anyway, I'm not an LSAT instructor, but what I remember is that there were certain questions where you could pretty much ignore what it said in the facts, right? You could look at what the call of the question was, and if you recognized it was a certain type of question, you could look at the answers and you could say, okay, when I see this in the call of the question, there's really only one of these answer choices that I can look at. And you could kind of ignore some of the other parts of the questions. And at least for me, that was how I was taught to do it, to help streamline some things with the exam. Anyway, here's the point. For the bar, we cannot do that. Because remember, if you go back to my first video, the things you have to know before you approach the bar exam, one of the very first things that I talk about in that video is the idea that this is a reading comp and a vocabulary exam. And so close reading of each of these sections is going to be important. Much more with the first 2 than with the third, with the answer choices, and we'll get into that, why we don't want to spend a lot of time in the answer choices. We want to spend most of our time in these first 2 sections, in the facts and in the call of the question. And that's maybe the biggest difference in terms of how I would approach this versus how we learned for the LSAT, and probably how, at least for me, a lot of the exams in law school are written, right? The biggest difference between the law school exams and the bar exams, your law school exams, your law professor has certain things that they really want to teach, and so they are going to have more of that. And this is, I'm massively generalizing here, but it's helpful for what we're talking about. Generally speaking, what you'll see is law professors are going to take a lot of those things that they talked about in class, right, those ideas, and they're going to be able to bake those into particular answer choices based on your time in class with that professor, a particular answer choice, you might know a particular answer choice to be correct or incorrect based on what that professor's talked about in class. And maybe what they're doing with a particular answer choice is they're saying, I talked about this in class. Let's see if the kids were really paying attention. That is not what they're doing on the bar exam. Bar exam is not going to have anything like that. And so what we want to understand is that we can't just look at answer choices on the bar exam without looking at the question and say confidently that we know the right answer. Because, as we'll see and as we talk about in some of our other videos, all the bar examiners have to do is change one word, add a not somewhere, or add a compels somewhere in different fact patterns, and you're going to see that we have a totally different answer. And you will see the answer choices are going to be split kind of down two roads for people who either caught that one word that's changing everything or didn't. And a lot of us, the first time you go through, you take this, we're so excited that we see something that we recognize, we don't read closely, and we end up picking this answer that the bar examiners are hoping and counting on, 40 to 50% of people incorrectly choosing because they didn't do the reading. How do the bar examiners stratify this exam? How do they separate people? A lot of it, believe it or not, is simple things like reading comprehension, like vocabulary, because that's something, again, that's fair, that's across the board. If you get an answer wrong because you didn't read it closely, you can't really go back to the bar examiners and say, well, that wasn't a fair question. Oh, no, it was a fair question. You just didn't read it closely. What we have to do with every bar question is we have to learn to read extremely, extremely carefully. Now, again, I talk about this is not how we read cases in law school. We could not read every case, at least I could not read every case in law school with the level of detail that we need to read bar questions. There's just too much law, too much of it's irrelevant. You can't function as a normal human being and do all of that stuff in law school. The good news is that on the bar exam, this really intense type of reading, we really only need to do it for a total of, and I'm not counting practice time, but on the bar exam, we really only need to do this for like a total of 12 hours of your entire life, right? 6 hours over 2 days. That's it. So it's painful. It's painful to learn to go through with your pencil or pen and touch every single word in a fact pattern. But I promise you, as you get in the habit of doing that, of this really close reading, combined with understanding all the things I talk about here and some other videos, if we can do that, we'll find these questions are really not that difficult. This isn't, as they like to say, this isn't rocket science. This isn't going to require, you don't have to know calculus. You don't have to perform any type of linear regression or any other things that I honestly don't even understand. This is reading comprehension and this is vocabulary. So let's get into it. We know that the bar exam, in every question, there's going to be a fact pattern. Now, sometimes the fact patterns are really long. Sometimes they're really short. What I want to emphasize here in terms of looking at these fact patterns, aside from what I talked about earlier, which is it demands really careful, really close reading. One thing that we'll commonly see the bar examiners do is throw in a bunch of other stuff that is just garbage, just BS, stuff that does not matter for the question. A perfect example of this is going to be in property. We're going to have a question about an easement, or we're going to have a question about a real estate contract. And in the fact pattern, the bar examiners are essentially going to cut and paste, probably from another question, really it's from their whole big bank of stuff they have, but they're going to cut and paste a recording statute where you're going to say, it's going to give you the facts about the conveyance, whatever. And then the next paragraph is going to say something like, in this jurisdiction, the recording statute is as follows, or the relevant statute in this jurisdiction says no conveyance shall be good against blah, blah, blah. People see that, they recognize that it was a recording statute. Yeah, this is when property stopped kind of making sense to me, okay, yeah. And so recording statute, but hey, I remember Bob talked about, we just have to match elements. There's this one answer here that's going to talk about a recording statute. Pick that. That is an example of misapplying, of missing what I'm trying to talk about here. So yes, this is all vocabulary. Yes, this is all reading comprehension. But we can't do any of this in a vacuum. And what we're going to see is that if we carefully read what's in the facts, we might see that, yeah, there's this thing that's talking about contract. This is real estate contract, right? And then there's this other thing talking about the recording statute. Just based on those two pieces of information, we don't have enough to do anything with yet. So we have to move to that next section. And again, all I want to point out here is that one particular bar question, except in the rarest of cases, and we'll talk about these exceptions, but every MBE question can only be testing you on one topic, on one rule, one issue at a time. So we may have a fact pattern that gives us, that hints at 2 or 3 distinct issues, right? They might mention rule against perpetuities in there. They might, again, talk about the recording statute. They might talk about someone either wanting to or not wanting to convey a deed. So just based on that, that's 3 distinct issues. And there's going to be, we know, particular rules that go with each of those little areas. But just based on that, we don't know how to approach this question. We have to keep reading. So that brings us to the next section here, which is our call of the question. Now, I want to take a step back and again talk about how this is a little bit different than how we have things in law school, how maybe other multiple choice exams, whatever. Again, I said I wasn't going to talk about the LSAT. I'm finding myself talking about the LSAT a lot. Going through the LSAT and also then carrying that into law school, the way that I learned to read multiple choice questions, and I'm assuming many of you did too, is to read the call of the question first. So we read the call of the question and we say, okay, this question is talking about whatever. Then we go, and when we read the facts, we have a sense of, okay, we know what to look for. The problem with doing it that way on the bar exam is that because there's all this added pressure and stress, and because we're trying to keep all of these things in our head, and it's this compressed period of these are the 200 multiple choice questions that are going to determine whether you're a lawyer or not. We try to keep all these things in our head if we read the call of the question first and immediately focus all our thinking on that one issue as we've been trained to do, the problem is that it's really easy to misread, to miss things, to think about, to get that tunnel vision. And we know we're cognizant of the time. There's, even for a lot of us, it's not a negative thing, right? It's not a panic, but it's, oh my gosh, this is a relief. I see something I recognize. Good, I can jump for that. It's far easier to make mistakes if we read out of order. If we read the call of the question first, we get some of that, what they talk about, confirmation bias, right? That's a real thing. That's a real thing. If we go into reading the fact pattern after we've read the call of the question, there is at least a higher likelihood that we're going to misread something, because our brain is going to, our eyes, the eye connection to the brain, it's going to see something after we've looked at these fact patterns, 5,000 questions, right? Preparing for the bar exam, whatever number. You don't need to do 5,000 questions, but a lot of people do, right? Say you do 5,000 questions. Your eyes are going to get good at ignoring particular words that don't have anything to do with the issue that you're looking at. So all this is a really long-winded way of saying we got to read the questions in order. Now, for some people, that's going to be really difficult to do. And I admit, if you train yourself to always approach a multiple choice question, reading the call of the question first, it's going to take a while for you to learn to kind of unlearn that, if that makes sense, to learn to unlearn. But the point is, what we want to do is if we can't get away from that, if our brain is automatically just so programmed that we have to read the call of the question first, that's fine. This is the one and only time I'm going to encourage you on the bar exam to skim. So if you find yourself looking at the call of the question first, that's fine, but we always are going to have to return to the call of the question after we have a really good understanding of the facts. So again, this is not an exam where we're going to be reasoning, thinking, analyzing, litigating. This is also why I say that time can and really should be our friend on the bar exam. Because if we spend a full minute on just the facts, if you don't think a minute's a long time, listen to me talk for a minute. You'll get tired of hearing me pretty soon. The idea is that a minute is more than long enough if we're going through and looking at every individual word in our fact pattern. We understand what's going on with the facts. We understand that the facts might present us with more than one issue. It might tee up to go more than one different way. Okay, now we look at the call of the question. And again, going through with that same fine-tooth comb, what is this question asking? Now, if I've had a really good understanding of the facts, if I understand what the facts are saying, now is where we can put all that practice and all of that memorization and all that computational thinking into full effect. Because now we can say, okay, only one of these answer choices is going to have the elements presented correctly. Only one of these answer choices is going to have the elements connected to the facts that were in our question. And so if we can do that, if we can take the time to say, we're going to read each of these individually, the fact pattern, and then the call of the question, and we're going to do that in that sequence. We're going to really understand the facts. Then we're going to understand the call of the question. Now we know what answer choice we're looking for. And so in terms of how we're going to spend and allocate our time, we want to spend 70 to 80% of the time that we're going to allocate to a question, we want to spend that in the facts and in the call of the question. That's got to be the bulk, the massive bulk of the time. The answer choices purposely are going to be written in a way that's confusing, and we're going to see that in a second. So now when we talk about answer choices on MBE, what we have to understand is that these are where students have trouble. This is where people love to talk about tricks. And again, if you've watched my other videos, any bar instructor will tell you there's no tricks. And what every bar instructor, even the ones that are not good, will tell you is that there is no best answer. Right? The idea is that only one answer is correct. Again, getting back to that whole idea about, this is the most litigious group of people you're ever going to meet, right? You get the idea. The point is the bar examiners know this, and so they write the questions in such a way that they are objectively fair. How do you write an objectively fair question? There's only one answer that is objectively on its face true. How do they do that? Again, they count on people misreading. They count on people reading the call of the question and then skimming the facts, right? Not picking up that one particular sentence or that one particular condition. Maybe it's a contracts question and the whole thing was talking about this condition that had to be met. If we look at the call of the question, we recognize it's a question about conditions. We're reading, oh yeah, okay, here's all this stuff about conditions. Okay, I'm going to pick the answer. We didn't read closely enough and see that at the very end of that fact pattern, the one party said to the other, you know what, don't worry about it. And they waived the condition. And they waived the condition in like a clause at the end of a sentence. The point is this, if we spend our time looking at the answer choices are going to be, in many cases, really either vague, confusing, they're going to seem to be conflicting. They're going to either give you an outcome, a yes, no, and we're going to see that the 4 answer choices are usually broken in half. Half of them are going to have the outcome going one way, and half of them are going to have the outcome going the other way, right? Either there was a valid contract, wasn't a valid contract, there is an easement, there isn't an easement, right? Versus liable, they're not liable. And then aside from that distinction, we're going to see a further distinction where there's going to be the reasoning why. And this is where, again, they're not going to necessarily give you the reasoning why in the way that I'm explaining it to you, the way that you would explain it to someone if you were actually trying to teach them. And that's where the bar examiners get to use some of their cleverness and creativity. How can they take an answer that's the right answer and write it in a way that seems like it's the wrong answer? How can they take an answer that is the wrong answer, but write it in a way that seems like it could maybe be the correct answer, especially if you're going too fast, especially if you're intimidated by the questions, especially if you panic, right? That's why people end up picking those Latin answers that sometimes it's just Latin gibberish that they put on the exam. And people watching this video, incredibly smart people, you guys end up picking Latin gibberish. I end up picking Latin gibberish. Why? Not because if we sat down and thought about it, we have a good answer for why we're doing it. It's just because, we're intimidated by the question. We're playing law of averages, right? Eventually, one of these Latin answers is going to be right. And that is it, guys. That is the breakdown of an MBE question. Now, in the next video, we're going to get into the pitfalls, the mistakes that students tend to make when approaching these questions, and in a subsequent video, we're going to identify what the techniques, what the tactics that the bar examiners are liable to use. We can put those together, combined with everything that I've talked about in my prior videos, and we have a really, really strong foundation to start our bar prep with. So I hope to see you in the next video. Like I try to say in all my videos, I love each and every one of you. Please keep coming back. Get at me with any questions that you have. We are going to get through this together. Thanks a lot.